I stood in the corporate parking garage at 7:30 in the morning, security guard waiting beside my car with a termination letter. The new vice president of operations, Derek Walsh, had called me into his office yesterday afternoon with a smug expression, announcing cuts to bloated executive salaries. He handed me the pink slip without even reviewing my actual responsibilities. What he didn't realize was that by firing the senior director of financial operations, he had just triggered the most expensive mistake in corporate history. 8 years ago, I walked into Sterling Industries as a 24-year-old junior analyst with a finance degree from Ohio State and dreams bigger than my student loan debt. The manufacturing conglomerate operated 47 facilities across 32 states, specializing in automotive parts and aerospace components. Back then, the company felt like a sprawling empire of opportunity, and I was determined to prove myself worthy of climbing its ranks. My first supervisor, Patricia Williams, took me under her wing in the financial operations department. She taught me that managing a $2.4 billion operation required more than just number crunching. Every credit facility, every banking relationship, every covenant clause represented a delicate balance that kept thousands of jobs secure and millions of dollars flowing smoothly through the system. I absorbed everything Patricia shared with me: how the revolving credit facility worked, why maintaining specific debt-to-equity ratios mattered so much to our lenders, which bank executives held the real decision-making power beyond their titles. I stayed late reviewing contract amendments, spent weekends studying industry financing trends, and volunteered for every project that would deepen my understanding of corporate finance. The breakthrough moment came during my third year, when Sterling faced a supply chain crisis. Semiconductor shortages had delayed production schedules, creating a cash flow crunch that threatened our ability to meet quarterly covenant requirements. While senior executives panicked about potential defaults, I noticed an overlooked clause in our primary credit agreement that provided temporary relief for force majeure events. Patricia and I worked 72 hours straight, coordinating with 5 different banks to document the supply chain disruption and secure a 6-month covenant suspension. That weekend effort saved Sterling from a technical default that could have cost us our entire credit facility and sent the company into bankruptcy. 6 months later, Patricia announced her retirement, and CEO Helen Bradford surprised everyone by promoting me to Senior Director of Financial Operations. At 27, I became the youngest executive in company history to hold sole signatory authority on our primary banking relationships. The promotion came with incredible responsibility. I managed relationships with First National Bank, Commonwealth Trust, Regional Capital Partners, and 2 smaller institutions that collectively provided $700 million in revolving credit. Every quarterly covenant test, every annual renewal negotiation, every amendment request flowed through my desk. I loved the challenge. Building those banking relationships felt like constructing something permanent and valuable. James Patterson at First National became more than a relationship manager. He became a trusted advisor who helped me understand the nuances of institutional lending. Margaret Foster at Commonwealth Trust taught me how regulatory changes affected credit availability. These relationships took years to develop and represented millions of dollars in cost savings through favorable terms. My personal life settled into a comfortable routine. I rented a small apartment overlooking the Scioto River, close enough to walk to work on nice days. My younger sister Emma had just started her sophomore year at Ohio State, and we talked every Sunday about her classes and my latest projects. Emma always joked that I made banking sound more exciting than her criminal justice courses. Everything changed 6 months ago when Sterling hired Derek Walsh as Vice President of Operations. Derek came from a consulting firm in Chicago with promises of operational efficiency and cost optimization. Helen Bradford introduced him at the monthly all-hands meeting as someone who would help Sterling compete more effectively in challenging market conditions. From the beginning, Derek operated differently from other executives. He scheduled weekly golf outings with department heads, but somehow the invitations never reached the female managers. His first 90 days included reorganization of 3 departments, each resulting in a female director being replaced by a male colleague from his previous consulting firm. First, Janet Miller from Human Resources received a lateral transfer to a meaningless special projects role, while Derek's friend Tom Bradley took over as Director of People Operations. Then Linda Chen from Quality Assurance found herself reporting to a newly created Vice President of Process Excellence, another Derek associate named Ryan Murphy. Most recently, Diana Foster from Supply Chain Management was restructured out entirely when Derek consolidated her responsibilities under his direct control. The pattern disturbed me, but each change came with reasonable-sounding explanations about efficiency and modernization. Derek presented detailed PowerPoint presentations showing cost savings and operational improvements. The board seemed impressed with his systematic approach to organizational development. My first direct interaction with Derek happened during a quarterly business review. I had prepared a comprehensive presentation about our banking relationships, upcoming renewal negotiations, and potential opportunities for expanding our credit facilities. Derek arrived 15 minutes late, spent most of the meeting checking his phone, and concluded by suggesting that my department represented unnecessary administrative overhead. When I tried to explain the strategic importance of maintaining strong banking relationships, Derek dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. He said modern companies used automated systems for basic financial functions and questioned whether Sterling really needed a dedicated financial operations department. I left that meeting feeling frustrated and concerned about Derek's fundamental misunderstanding of how corporate finance worked. Over the following months, Derek consistently postponed or canceled meetings I requested to brief him on critical financial matters. When First National Bank needed updated organizational charts for their annual credit review, Derek's assistant told me to handle it directly without bothering him. When Commonwealth Trust requested confirmation of key personnel for covenant compliance, Derek said such administrative details didn't require executive attention. The final warning sign came 3 weeks ago during a senior staff meeting. Derek announced his intention to eliminate what he called redundant executive positions and right-size compensation structures. He specifically mentioned that Sterling carried too many directors and senior managers for a company of our size. The comment sent chills through everyone in the room, but Derek smiled as if he had shared wonderful news about operational improvements. That night, I called Emma to vent about the increasingly hostile work environment. She reminded me that I had built something valuable at Sterling and shouldn't let Derek's ignorance diminish my accomplishments. Emma was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Derek was planning something that would affect all the female executives who had survived his previous reorganizations. I spent that weekend reviewing every banking agreement and covenant clause, making sure all documentation was current and accessible. Something told me I might need those files sooner than expected. Friday afternoon felt different from the moment I arrived at the office. Derek's assistant, Kelly, avoided making eye contact when I passed her desk. The usual chatter in the executive hallway seemed muted, and I noticed several closed-door conversations that stopped when I approached. At 4:30, Kelly called my extension with a request that made my stomach drop. Derek wanted to see me in his office immediately for a brief discussion about departmental restructuring. The timing felt deliberately chosen. Most executives had already left for the weekend, and the building would be nearly empty by 5 o'clock. I gathered my portfolio and walked down the hall to Derek's corner office. He had redecorated the space with expensive furniture and motivational posters about efficiency and results. His desk was positioned to create maximum distance between himself and visitors, forcing people to sit in uncomfortably low chairs while he looked down from his elevated executive seat. Derek didn't bother with pleasantries when I entered. He gestured toward the visitor chair while finishing a phone call about weekend golf plans. After hanging up, he opened a folder and began reading from what was clearly a prepared script about organizational optimization and fiscal responsibility. "Katrina, we need to discuss some important changes affecting your position." Derek began with the tone of someone who had practiced this speech. Sterling Industries has grown top-heavy over the years, and we're carrying excessive compensation costs in administrative functions. As part of our operational efficiency initiative, We're eliminating redundant executive roles and consolidating responsibilities under more experienced leadership. I felt my chest tighten, but I tried to maintain professional composure. Derek, I'm not sure what you mean by redundant. The Financial Operations Department manages $700 million in credit facilities. These relationships require constant attention and specialized expertise. Derek waved his hand dismissively, as if I had mentioned something trivial like office supplies. Katrina, what you're describing is basic administrative work. Account management and paperwork processing don't require director-level positions in a modern organization. My colleague Jake Morrison has extensive experience in financial oversight from our consulting days. He'll be consolidating your responsibilities into his existing operations role. The words hit me like a physical blow. Derek was eliminating my position and handing my responsibilities to Jake Morrison, someone with no background in banking relationships or debt covenant management. Jake had spent his career optimizing supply chains and improving manufacturing processes. He knew nothing about the complex web of financial agreements that kept Sterling operating. Derek, I don't think you understand what my position actually involves, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm the sole signatory on our primary credit facilities. The banking agreements require specific approval processes for any changes in key personnel. You can't just transfer those responsibilities without going through proper procedures with our lenders. Derek's expression showed irritation at being questioned. Katrina, I've reviewed the organizational structure, and your role amounts to glorified bookkeeping. Jake will handle the important strategic decisions while supporting staff manages the routine paperwork. We need executives who understand operational efficiency, not people who get bogged down in administrative details. I realized Derek had no idea what he was talking about. He saw my department as a cost center rather than the foundation that enabled every other business operation. In his mind, managing banking relationships meant updating spreadsheets and filing reports. He didn't understand that those relationships represented years of trust building and negotiated terms that saved Sterling millions of dollars annually. Derek, the banking covenants specifically require notification before terminating key personnel. There are legal and financial implications to changing signatories on major credit facilities. This isn't something you can just decide in a Friday afternoon meeting. His face darkened with annoyance. Katrina, I appreciate your concern, but you're not in a position to dictate company policy. These decisions have been made at levels above your pay grade. Jake will begin transitioning your responsibilities immediately, and you'll spend your final 2 weeks bringing him up to speed on the basic administrative procedures. The condescending tone made my anger surge, but I forced myself to remain calm. What do you mean by final 2 weeks? Are you terminating my employment? Derek opened the folder and removed a termination letter with my name already printed at the top. Sterling Industries is eliminating your position effective today. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay plus accrued vacation time. The transition period will allow Jake to understand whatever systems you've been using to track vendor relationships and payment schedules. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Derek was firing me for managing what he called vendor relationships and payment schedules. He thought my job involved processing invoices rather than maintaining the credit facilities that kept Sterling operational. The depth of his misunderstanding would have been comical if it weren't so catastrophic. Derek, I need to explain something crucial about the banking agreements. If you terminate my employment, you'll trigger automatic covenant violations on our primary credit facility. The banks require 60 to 90 days notice for signatory changes, and they need to approve any replacement through their credit committee process. Derek stood up and walked around his desk, clearly eager to end the conversation. Katrina, I understand you're disappointed about losing your position, but these kinds of scare tactics aren't helpful. Jake is perfectly capable of handling basic banking relationships. We're not restructuring rocket science here. I felt a moment of clarity about what was happening. Derek wasn't just firing me. He was deliberately dismantling the financial infrastructure I had built over 8 years. Whether from ignorance or malice, He was destroying systems that protected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in operations. "I need you to understand the consequences of this decision," I said, making one final attempt to prevent disaster. "Our primary credit facility has a $700 million limit, and the covenant structure requires specific personnel to remain in place. If you fire me, the bank will call the loan within 24 hours. Derek's laugh was genuinely amused, as if I had told him a funny story. "Katrina, no bank is going to call a $700 million loan because someone lost their job. That's not how business works. You might want to consider updating your resume for positions that better match your skill level." He handed me the termination letter and called security to escort me from the building. As I packed my personal belongings under supervision, I watched 8 years of careful work being casually discarded by someone who understood none of it. The framed photograph of my promotion ceremony, the awards for exceptional performance, the thank you notes from banking partners, all of it suddenly felt like artifacts from a different world. Walking through the parking garage toward my car, I realized Derek had just made the most expensive mistake in corporate history. By Monday morning, Sterling Industries would face the immediate repayment of $700 million, and Derek would discover that ignorance was far more dangerous than the inefficiencies he thought he was eliminating. My phone rang at 6:15 Monday morning while I was making coffee in my apartment kitchen. The caller ID showed James Patterson from First National Bank, and my stomach immediately clenched with dread. James never called before 8 o'clock unless something was seriously wrong. "Katrina, I'm calling about your employment status at Sterling," James said, without his usual friendly greeting. "Our automated covenant monitoring system flagged a personnel change over the weekend. Can you confirm whether you're still with the company?" I gripped the phone tighter, knowing this conversation would change everything. "James, I was terminated Friday afternoon. Derek Walsh, the new VP of Operations, eliminated my position as part of what he called operational efficiency improvements." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. When James finally spoke, his voice carried a tone I had never heard from him before, a mixture of shock and professional concern that made my chest tighten. "Katrina, you understand what this means for the credit facility? The covenant structure specifically identifies you as the required signatory for all facility operations. Your termination constitutes an automatic technical default under Section 4.7 of the Master Agreement." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, feeling the full weight of Derek's catastrophic decision. I tried to explain the covenant requirements to Derek, but he dismissed my concerns. He thinks banking relationships are just administrative paperwork. He has no idea what he's triggered. James was quiet for another moment, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I'm looking at the covenant language now. The bank has a legal obligation to issue a demand notice within 24 hours of any key person departure. Unless Sterling can immediately cure the violation or provide an acceptable replacement signatory, we have no choice but to call the loan." The practical reality of James's words hit me like a physical blow. Sterling Industries would have until Tuesday morning to either reinstate me or find an alternative that satisfied the bank's requirements. Given the complexity of banking regulations and credit approval processes, neither option was remotely feasible in such a short time frame. "What about Jake Morrison, Derek's friend who's supposed to take over my responsibilities?" I asked. Even though I already knew the answer, any new signatory would need to go through our full credit approval process, James explained. Background checks, financial verification, board authorization, regulatory compliance reviews. Even with expedited processing, we're looking at 60 to 90 days minimum, and that's assuming the candidate meets all our criteria. I closed my eyes, imagining the chaos that would erupt at Sterling when James made his official call to the company. Derek had fired the one person who could prevent a $700 million disaster, replacing her with someone who couldn't possibly qualify as a substitute signatory in time to avoid default. "James, what happens when you call the loan? What are Sterling's options at that point?" His sigh was audible through the phone. "Honestly, Katrina, I don't know how they'll find $700 million on such short notice. They could try to arrange bridge financing from other institutions, but no bank will touch that kind of emergency credit without extensive due diligence. They might explore asset sales or emergency equity raises, but again, these things take months to arrange properly. After ending the call with James, I sat in my kitchen watching the sunrise over the Scioto River and thinking about the thousands of Sterling employees who had no idea their jobs were about to be threatened by Derek's arrogance. Production workers who had spent decades building automotive components, engineers who designed aerospace systems, administrative staff who processed payroll and managed benefits. All of them would suffer because Derek couldn't be bothered to understand the financial infrastructure that supported their livelihoods. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Martinez, my friend in Sterling's legal department. Emergency board meeting called for 8 a.m. Derek looks panicked. Robert from finance is pacing the hallway. Something big is happening. I quickly typed back. The bank is calling the $700 million credit facility. Derek triggered covenant violations by firing me. Sarah's response came immediately. Oh my God! That's impossible to repay on short notice. This could destroy the company. At 8:30, my phone rang again. This time, the caller was Robert Martinez, Sterling's chief financial officer. Robert and I had worked together for years on quarterly covenant compliance and annual facility renewals. His voice was strained when he spoke. Katrina, please tell me there's some way to resolve this covenant situation. Derek is claiming you never explained the personnel requirements, but I remember you briefing the executive team about key person clauses during last year's renewal process. Robert, I tried to warn Derek about the covenant implications, but he wouldn't listen. He said banking relationships were just administrative work that Jake could handle. I have emails documenting my attempts to schedule meetings about critical financial matters that Derek canceled or postponed. Robert's exhale was audible. The board is demanding explanations, and Derek is trying to blame you for not properly documenting the requirements. Can you come in this morning to meet with our legal team? We need to understand all our options. I felt a surge of anger at Derek's predictable attempt to shift responsibility for his own ignorance. Robert, I'm not coming in to clean up Derek's mess. He fired me for trying to do my job properly. If Sterling wants my help now, they need to acknowledge that Derek made a catastrophic error and take responsibility for the consequences. Katrina, I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be upset. But thousands of jobs are at stake here. Is there any way you could consider returning temporarily to resolve the banking situation? The irony was almost overwhelming. 24 hours after Derek dismissed me as redundant administrative overhead, Sterling was begging me to return and save them from bankruptcy. But Derek's actions had revealed something deeper than mere ignorance. They showed a fundamental disrespect for expertise and a willingness to destroy what he didn't understand. Robert, even if I wanted to help, Derek would have to admit he was completely wrong about my role and the importance of maintaining proper banking relationships. He would have to publicly acknowledge that firing me was a catastrophic mistake that threatens the entire company. Is Derek prepared to do that? The silence on Robert's end told me everything I needed to know. Derek's pride would never allow him to admit such a fundamental error in judgment, especially not in front of the board and executive team. He would rather risk destroying the company than acknowledge that a woman he had dismissed as redundant actually held the key to Sterling's financial survival. By 10 o'clock Monday morning, financial news outlets were reporting rumors of liquidity problems at Sterling Industries. The company's stock price dropped 23% in pre-market trading as investors reacted to speculation about potential bankruptcy or emergency restructuring. Suppliers who normally extended 30-day payment terms began demanding cash on delivery, sensing weakness in Sterling's financial position. I spent Monday afternoon watching the crisis unfold from my apartment while contemplating the magnitude of Derek's catastrophic decision. His attempt to eliminate what he saw as redundant overhead had instead triggered the most expensive mistake in corporate history. By Tuesday morning, Sterling Industries would face an impossible choice: find $700 million immediately or begin bankruptcy proceedings. Derek had gotten exactly what he wanted: elimination of expensive executive positions. Unfortunately for him, he was about to discover that some positions were expensive precisely because the consequences of eliminating them were far more costly than maintaining them. Tuesday morning brought news coverage that confirmed my worst fears about Derek's next move. Sterling Industries had called a company-wide meeting for 10 o'clock to address what Derek termed temporary financial restructuring challenges. The announcement, released through official company channels, promised full transparency about recent developments and our path forward. I watched the live stream from my apartment as Derek stood behind the podium in Sterling's main conference room, facing hundreds of worried employees who had seen their stock options evaporate overnight. His confident demeanor from Friday afternoon had been replaced by nervous energy and defensive body language. Team, I want to address some of the speculation that's been circulating about Sterling's financial position, Derek began. Reading carefully from prepared remarks, we are currently working through a temporary banking situation that resulted from inadequate transition procedures by a former employee who failed to properly document critical financial responsibilities. The blame game had begun exactly as I expected. Derek was positioning himself as the victim of poor documentation, rather than acknowledging his own negligent decision-making. He continued reading from his script, describing me as a disgruntled former employee who had deliberately withheld important information during the transition process. Our previous financial operations director failed to provide adequate briefings about certain banking procedures. Derek explained to the increasingly concerned audience. This oversight has created some short-term complications with our credit facility, but we are confident in our ability to resolve these issues quickly and move forward with our operational efficiency improvements. I felt my anger building as Derek systematically distorted the truth. He was telling hundreds of employees that I had sabotaged the company rather than admitting his own fundamental misunderstanding of corporate finance. The audacity of claiming I had withheld information when he had consistently refused to attend meetings about banking relationships was breathtaking. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. This is unbelievable. Everyone knows Derek is lying. He canceled 3 meetings with you about banking matters in the last month alone. The company-wide meeting continued with Derek taking questions from increasingly agitated employees. Production supervisors wanted to know whether facilities would remain operational. Administrative staff asked about payroll security. Engineering managers questioned whether ongoing projects would receive funding. Derek's answers revealed the depth of his panic. He promised that operations would continue normally while admitting that some temporary adjustments might be necessary. He assured employees that their jobs were secure, while acknowledging that workforce optimization remained part of the company's strategic plan. Every response contradicted itself, creating more confusion and anxiety. The final question came from a 20-year veteran in quality assurance. Derek, if our former financial operations director was so incompetent, why did we just receive a $700 million loan demand that requires immediate repayment? Derek's face flushed red as he struggled to answer. That question involves confidential financial information that I can't discuss in a public forum. Our legal and financial teams are addressing all aspects of our banking relationships. After the meeting ended, I received a call from Amanda Richardson, an employment attorney whose name I had found through online research. Amanda specialized in executive wrongful termination cases and had particular expertise in gender discrimination matters. I watched Derek's presentation this morning, Amanda said after I explained my situation. His public statements about your alleged failure to document responsibilities could constitute defamation if we can prove they're false. Do you have evidence showing you attempted to brief him about the banking requirements? I pulled out my laptop and began scrolling through email records. I have documentation of multiple meeting requests that Derek canceled or postponed. I also have emails explaining the covenant requirements that Derek never responded to. There's a clear pattern of him dismissing financial operations as unimportant administrative work. Amanda was quiet while taking notes. This sounds like more than simple wrongful termination. If Derek systematically ignored critical financial information and then blamed you publicly for his mistakes, We might have grounds for defamation and possibly securities fraud if his statements misled investors. By Wednesday afternoon, Amanda's team had uncovered something that transformed our entire legal strategy. While reviewing Derek's consulting contracts and hiring decisions, they discovered financial irregularities that went far beyond simple bias in personnel decisions. Katrina, we need to talk about Derek's relationship with his former consulting firm, Amanda said during an emergency phone conference. The contracts he awarded to his friends appear to violate Sterling's procurement policies, and some of the payments look questionable. Amanda's investigators had found that Derek had awarded no-bid consulting contracts worth over $4 million to his former colleagues at Strategic Solutions Consulting. The contracts claimed to provide operational efficiency analysis and process optimization studies, but the deliverables were vague and the pricing appeared inflated. More disturbing, Derek had received personal benefits from these arrangements. Strategic Solutions had paid for Derek's membership at an exclusive golf club, covered his travel expenses to industry conferences, and even subsidized his daughter's private school tuition. These payments violated federal regulations, requiring disclosure of conflicts of interest in corporate contract awards. This is starting to look like a kickback scheme, Amanda explained. Derek was using his position at Sterling to enrich his friends, while personally benefiting from the arrangements. The fact that he fired you to install Jake Morrison, another Strategic Solutions alum, suggests the scheme was escalating. I felt a mix of vindication and disgust as the full scope of Derek's corruption became clear. He hadn't just made an ignorant mistake about banking covenants. He had been systematically looting Sterling while eliminating anyone who might question his activities. Thursday morning brought news that Derek's problems were multiplying exponentially. The Securities and Exchange Commission had opened an investigation into Sterling's disclosure practices after receiving whistleblower complaints about potential fraud in executive compensation and vendor relationships. Federal prosecutors in Chicago were reportedly examining whether Derek's consulting arrangements violated federal anti-corruption statutes. The investigation had expanded beyond Sterling to include Strategic Solutions Consulting and several other companies where Derek's network had awarded similar contracts. Derek's attempt to destroy my reputation was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of focusing blame on a terminated employee, media attention was shifting to questions about Derek's qualifications, his hiring practices, and the financial arrangements that had accompanied his appointment as vice president. Friday afternoon, Sarah called with news that made everything clear. Katrina, Derek just submitted his resignation. The board accepted it immediately and announced that he's being terminated for cause. They're bringing in an interim management team to clean up the mess. Derek's downfall had taken exactly 1 week. His attempt to eliminate expensive overhead had instead triggered investigations that revealed millions of dollars in fraudulent activities. The man who had dismissed me as redundant administrative overhead was now facing potential federal charges for embezzlement and corruption. But the damage to Sterling Industries was already done. The company still faced $700 million in immediate debt obligations, and Derek's corruption scandal had made emergency financing nearly impossible to obtain. Thousands of innocent employees were paying the price for Derek's arrogance and criminal behavior. Justice was beginning to emerge, but the real reckoning was just beginning. With Derek's resignation and the corruption investigation gaining momentum, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my career. I could accept Sterling's inevitable settlement offer, take the money, and quietly rebuild my life somewhere else. Or I could fight back against the entire system that had enabled Derek's destructive behavior and create lasting change for other women facing similar discrimination. Amanda Richardson had been blunt about the challenges ahead. Katrina, you have a strong wrongful termination case and potential defamation claims, but pursuing this aggressively will be expensive and time-consuming. Derek's criminal exposure gives us leverage for a quick settlement if you want to move on with your life. But moving on felt like abandoning the broader fight against the boys' club mentality that Derek represented. His systematic replacement of female executives with unqualified male friends was part of a pattern I had seen throughout my career in corporate America. If I didn't stand up now, the next woman, facing similar discrimination might not have the resources or evidence to fight back. Amanda, I want to pursue this as far as legally possible. Derek's behavior was part of a deliberate pattern, and Sterling Industries enabled him by failing to provide proper oversight. If we don't hold them accountable, this will happen again. Over the following weeks, Amanda assembled a team that included employment discrimination specialists, securities law experts, and forensic accountants. The investigation revealed that Derek's corruption was even more extensive than initially suspected. Financial forensics showed that Strategic Solutions Consulting had received over $12 million in contracts from Sterling during Derek's 6 months as vice president. The consulting firm had produced minimal deliverables, while Derek received personal benefits worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every female executive Derek had eliminated had been replaced by someone connected to Strategic Solutions, creating a clear pattern of pay to play corruption. The SEC investigation expanded to include potential securities violations related to Derek's failure to disclose his conflicts of interest. Federal prosecutors filed charges including wire fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal anti-corruption statutes. Derek faced up to 20 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts. Meanwhile, I was building a public case for institutional accountability. Amanda arranged interviews with major financial news networks where I could tell the real story behind Sterling's crisis. The narrative of a corrupt executive destroying a company through ignorance and greed resonated with journalists covering corporate governance issues. My first television appearance was on Financial Focus, a weekly program that reached millions of business professionals. The host, Jennifer Walsh, had done extensive research on Sterling's situation and asked pointed questions about systemic problems in corporate America. Katrina, you're saying that Derek Walsh fired you specifically because you were female and posed a threat to his corrupt scheme? Jennifer asked during the live interview. Derek targeted every female executive who might have questioned his activities, I replied. He systematically replaced experienced women with unqualified men from his former consulting firm. My firing triggered the $700 million crisis, but that was just the most visible consequence of his broader pattern of discrimination and corruption. The interview generated enormous response from viewers who shared similar experiences with workplace discrimination and corporate corruption. Women across various industries contacted Amanda's office with stories about executives who had systematically eliminated female leadership while enriching personal networks. Industry organizations began paying attention to the Sterling case as an example of how discrimination and corruption could intersect to create catastrophic business failures. The National Association of Women in Finance invited me to speak at their annual conference about the importance of maintaining diverse leadership in financial operations. My speaking engagement at the finance conference was particularly satisfying because it allowed me to address the systemic issues that had enabled Derek's behavior. The audience of several hundred financial professionals listened intently as I explained how boys' club mentality could lead to disastrous business decisions. When you replace expertise with loyalty, when you prioritize personal relationships over professional qualifications, you create conditions for both discrimination and corruption. Derek Walsh couldn't distinguish between administrative work and strategic financial management because he had never bothered to learn the difference. His ignorance wasn't just biased, it was dangerous. The conference presentation led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting requests from companies wanting to avoid similar disasters. Law firms began citing the Sterling case in gender discrimination litigation. Business schools started using Derek's downfall as a case study in ethics and corporate governance courses. But the most satisfying development came when federal prosecutors offered Derek a plea bargain that required full cooperation in recovering stolen funds and testifying about corruption in the consulting industry. Derek's lawyer tried to negotiate better terms, but the evidence was overwhelming and the potential prison sentence was too severe to risk at trial. In October, Derek pleaded guilty to 14 federal charges, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. As part of his plea agreement, he agreed to pay full restitution to Sterling Industries and cooperate with ongoing investigations into Strategic Solutions Consulting and their network of corporate clients. The plea hearing was the first time I had seen Derek since he fired me 6 months earlier. He looked significantly older, having lost weight and developed a nervous tic that made his left eye twitch constantly. When asked by the federal judge whether he understood the consequences of his actions, Derek's voice was barely audible as he acknowledged destroying Sterling Industries and harming thousands of innocent employees. Sterling Industries itself was undergoing dramatic changes. The board had hired a new CEO, Patricia Williams, my former mentor, who had returned from retirement to help rebuild the company's culture and operations. Patricia immediately implemented new governance policies, requiring financial literacy training for all executives and mandatory disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. The company had successfully restructured its debt obligations after I agreed to consult on the process, helping maintain banking relationships that Derek's actions had nearly destroyed. Production facilities remained operational, and employment levels had stabilized as Sterling worked to rebuild its reputation with customers and suppliers. Most importantly, Patricia had recruited several highly qualified women for senior leadership positions, creating the diverse executive team that Derek had systematically dismantled. The new leadership structure included safeguards specifically designed to prevent future discrimination and ensure that financial expertise was properly valued and protected. By December, my legal team had secured settlements totaling $12.5 million from Sterling Industries and various insurance carriers. The settlements included acknowledgement that Derek's actions had violated federal employment discrimination laws and that Sterling had failed to provide adequate oversight of his activities. But money wasn't the most important outcome. The Sterling case had become a landmark example of how individual courage could create systemic change when supported by strong legal advocacy and public attention. Other women facing similar discrimination now had a successful precedent to reference in their own legal battles. Derek Walsh had tried to eliminate me as redundant overhead. Instead, his actions had transformed me into a powerful advocate for corporate accountability and women's rights in the workplace. The reckoning he had tried to avoid was now reshaping entire industries. The courtroom was packed on the morning of Derek Walsh's sentencing hearing. Representatives from Sterling Industries, federal prosecutors, victim advocacy groups, and financial media filled every available seat. Derek sat at the defendant's table looking diminished and defeated, a stark contrast to the arrogant executive who had fired me 8 months earlier. Federal Judge Martha Coleman had presided over the case with extraordinary attention to detail. She had reviewed thousands of pages of evidence documenting Derek's systematic corruption and the devastating impact of his actions on Sterling Industries and its employees. The judge's reputation for tough sentences in white-collar crime cases meant Derek faced significant prison time regardless of his cooperation agreement. Prosecutor Sarah Chen began by outlining the scope of Derek's criminal enterprise. Your Honor, this defendant didn't just steal money from Sterling Industries. He corrupted the entire executive structure, eliminated qualified personnel based on gender bias, and created a culture where personal loyalty mattered more than professional competence. His actions threatened thousands of jobs and nearly destroyed a company with 75 years of successful operations. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Derek's scheme had cost Sterling Industries over $30 million in fraudulent consulting fees, emergency financing costs, and lost business relationships. His systematic replacement of female executives had eliminated decades of institutional knowledge while installing unqualified personnel who further damaged company operations. Amanda Richardson addressed the court on my behalf, describing the personal and professional impact of Derek's discriminatory actions. Miss Katrina Foster was targeted for elimination not because of poor performance, but because her expertise and integrity posed a threat to the defendant's corrupt scheme. His false public statements about her professional competence constituted defamation designed to justify his own catastrophic mistakes. When Judge Coleman invited me to make a victim impact statement, I had prepared remarks that focused on the broader implications of Derek's behavior rather than just personal grievances. Standing before the court, I thought about all the women who had faced similar discrimination without the resources or evidence to fight back effectively. Your Honor, Derek Walsh's actions reveal how quickly corruption and discrimination can destroy institutions that took decades to build. He eliminated experienced professionals based on gender bias, while installing a network of unqualified associates who nearly bankrupted Sterling Industries. His behavior wasn't just criminal, it was a betrayal of every employee who depended on competent leadership to protect their livelihoods. Derek's own statement to the court was brief and appeared scripted by his defense attorney. He acknowledged that his actions had caused harm and expressed regret for the consequences faced by Sterling employees, but his words lacked the genuine remorse that might have influenced the judge's sentencing decision. Judge Coleman's sentencing remarks were comprehensive and forceful. This case demonstrates how individual corruption can cascade into systemic harm, affecting thousands of innocent people. The defendant's actions were motivated by greed, enabled by bias, and executed through a pattern of deliberate deception that continued even after the consequences became apparent. Derek was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He was ordered to pay $32 million in restitution to Sterling Industries and individual victims of his discrimination. The judge also imposed a lifetime ban on Derek serving in any executive capacity at publicly traded companies. The criminal conviction was only part of the justice Derek faced. Professional organizations revoked his certifications, making him permanently unemployable in corporate consulting. His wife filed for divorce after discovering the full extent of his financial crimes and extramarital affairs. Derek lost his house, his country club memberships, and his social standing in the Chicago business community. Jake Morrison, Derek's friend who had been intended to replace me, faced his own legal consequences for participating in the consulting fraud. Jake received a 3-year prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution for his role in the scheme. Strategic Solutions Consulting was dissolved after federal prosecutors seized its assets and charged multiple employees with conspiracy and fraud. The broader industry impact was equally satisfying. The SEC implemented new disclosure requirements for executive compensation and vendor relationships based partly on the Sterling case. Congressional hearings on corporate governance cited Derek's actions as evidence for stronger oversight of executive decision-making in publicly traded companies. Professional associations in finance and operations began requiring mandatory training on discrimination and ethical decision-making. Business schools incorporated the Sterling case into their curricula as an example of how poor governance and bias could create catastrophic business failures. Most personally meaningful was the career renaissance I experienced after the case concluded. Titan Corp Industries, one of Sterling's main competitors, offered me the position of Chief Financial Officer with a compensation package that reflected the true value of financial operations expertise. The role came with complete authority over banking relationships and a mandate to build ethical financial practices throughout the organization. Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management invited me to serve as a visiting professor teaching courses on corporate finance and business ethics. The opportunity allowed me to share lessons from the Sterling case with future business leaders while continuing my consulting practice. Publishing houses competed to acquire rights to my memoir about fighting corporate corruption. Covenant Keeper: How I Stopped a Corporate Criminal became a bestseller and was optioned for film adaptation. The book's success provided a platform for speaking about workplace discrimination and corporate accountability at universities and professional conferences nationwide. But the most rewarding recognition came from other women who had successfully challenged discrimination in their own workplaces. My case had provided legal precedents and public visibility that empowered others to fight back against similar treatment. Employment attorneys across the country were citing Sterling versus Walsh in their discrimination litigation, creating a body of law that strengthened protections for all workers. Emma, my sister, had followed the entire case through law school and decided to specialize in employment discrimination law. She joined Amanda Richardson's firm as an associate attorney, focusing on cases involving gender bias in executive hiring and promotion decisions. Having Emma work alongside the legal team that had vindicated my career felt like perfect symmetry. The final chapter of Derek's downfall came when federal prosecutors expanded their investigation to include his activities at previous employers. Evidence emerged that Derek had used similar schemes to eliminate female executives and enrich his network at multiple companies over nearly a decade. Additional charges were filed, ensuring that Derek would spend most of his remaining career years in federal prison. Derek Walsh had fired me, believing that financial operations was redundant overhead that could be eliminated without consequences. Instead, his actions had triggered investigations that exposed systemic corruption, changed federal regulations, influenced academic curricula, and created legal precedents protecting workers nationwide. The justice system had worked exactly as intended, and Derek was facing consequences proportional to the enormous harm his actions had caused. But the most satisfying outcome was knowing that his attempts to silence and sideline qualified women had instead amplified our voices and strengthened our position in corporate America. 2 years after Derek Walsh fired me from Sterling Industries, I stood behind the podium at Titan Corp's annual shareholder meeting as the company's chief financial officer. The quarterly financial reports I was presenting showed record revenues and the strongest banking relationships in Titan Corp's history. The irony was not lost on me that Derek's attempt to eliminate financial operations expertise had instead led to my promotion to the most senior financial position in the industry. Titan Corp's CEO, Margaret Foster, had recruited me specifically because of my experience building ethical financial practices and preventing the kind of governance failures that had destroyed Sterling Industries. My first year at Titan Corp focused on strengthening banking relationships, implementing robust covenant monitoring systems, and creating policies that would prevent any future Derek Walsh from threatening the company's financial stability. The work was intellectually challenging and personally rewarding in ways I had never experienced during my years at Sterling. Titan Corp's leadership team valued expertise over politics, and my input on strategic decisions was sought and respected by colleagues across all departments. The company's commitment to ethical practices and diverse leadership created an environment where competence was rewarded regardless of gender or background. My consulting practice had grown beyond anything I could have imagined when Amanda Richardson first suggested pursuing Derek's case aggressively. Companies across multiple industries sought my expertise in financial operations, banking relationships, and corporate governance. The Sterling case had established my reputation as someone who could identify and prevent the kind of systemic failures that Derek's corruption had created. The consulting work was particularly meaningful because it allowed me to help other women advance in financial leadership roles. Many companies were realizing that diverse perspectives in financial operations could prevent groupthink and improve decision-making. My clients specifically requested guidance on building inclusive leadership teams and eliminating bias in promotion decisions. Northwestern University's appointment as visiting professor had evolved into a permanent faculty position teaching corporate finance and business ethics. The Sterling case provided real-world examples that resonated with students who would soon enter corporate environments where they might face similar challenges with discrimination and corruption. My courses consistently ranked among the most popular in the business school curriculum because students understood they were learning from someone who had actually fought and won against systemic workplace bias. Many female students told me that studying the Sterling case gave them confidence to pursue careers in finance, despite concerns about gender discrimination in corporate America. The memoir Covenant Keeper had exceeded all sales expectations and was being translated into multiple languages for international distribution. Reader responses from around the world showed that Derek's pattern of corruption and discrimination was unfortunately common across many different business cultures and legal systems. The book's film adaptation was scheduled to begin production next year with an Academy Award-winning actress attached to play my role. The screenplay focused on the David versus Goliath aspects of fighting corporate corruption while highlighting broader themes about integrity and persistence in the face of institutional bias. More importantly, the book had inspired dozens of other women to share their own experiences with workplace discrimination and corporate retaliation. A movement was building among professional women who were no longer willing to accept discriminatory treatment as an inevitable part of corporate advancement. My personal life had found balance and happiness that I had never thought possible during the dark months of fighting Derek's corruption. David Richardson, Amanda's brother and a professor of economics at Northwestern, had become my partner in both professional and personal endeavors. We had met during a conference on corporate governance and discovered shared interests in ethical business practices and social justice advocacy. David and I married in a small ceremony attended by family, close friends, and colleagues who had supported me throughout the Sterling battle. Emma served as maid of honor after passing the bar exam and joining Amanda Richardson's law firm as a specialist in employment discrimination cases. The wedding felt like a celebration not just of our relationship, but of everything we had built together in fighting for justice and accountability. We were in the process of adopting two siblings, 8-year-old Marcus and 10-year-old Christina, whose parents had died in a car accident. Providing a stable home for children who had experienced trauma felt like a natural extension of the advocacy work that had come to define my career. David and I wanted to give Marcus and Christina the kind of supportive environment that would allow them to pursue their dreams, regardless of the obstacles they might face. Emma had followed in my footsteps by specializing in employment law, but her approach was more aggressive and systematic than mine had been. She was building class action cases against companies with patterns of discrimination similar to what Derek had practiced at Sterling. Emma's legal work was creating industry-wide changes that would protect future generations of women from the treatment I had endured. The Sterling Industries saga had concluded with complete vindication for everyone Derek had targeted. Patricia Williams had successfully rebuilt the company's culture and financial stability, creating an inclusive leadership team that valued expertise over personal relationships. The company was thriving under ethical management and had become a model for other organizations seeking to prevent corruption and discrimination. Derek Walsh was serving his 15-year sentence at a federal prison in Illinois, with no possibility of early parole given the severity of his crimes. Prison reports indicated that he was having difficulty adjusting to incarceration and had been placed in protective custody after conflicts with other inmates. The man who had once wielded executive authority was now completely powerless and facing daily consequences for his actions. Strategic Solutions Consulting had been permanently dissolved, with its assets distributed among the victims of Derek's fraud schemes. Jake Morrison and other conspirators were serving their own prison sentences while facing civil liability that would prevent them from rebuilding their careers in consulting or corporate management. The regulatory and legislative changes inspired by the Sterling case were having impact across American business. The SEC had implemented new requirements for executive background checks and conflict of interest disclosures. Congressional legislation was pending that would strengthen whistleblower protections and increase penalties for discrimination in executive hiring practices. Most satisfying was the cultural change I observed in corporate America's approach to financial operations and risk management. Companies were investing more heavily in qualified financial leadership and recognizing that diversity in decision-making could prevent catastrophic mistakes like Derek's covenant violations. Professional associations had created award programs, recognizing women who had shown courage in fighting workplace discrimination. I was honored to be the first recipient of the American Finance Association's Ethical Leadership Award, which carried a substantial cash prize that I donated to organizations supporting women facing employment discrimination. Looking back on the 2 years since Derek fired me, I realized that his attempt to silence and sideline me had instead amplified my voice and expanded my influence beyond anything I could have achieved by simply doing my job quietly at Sterling Industries. His corruption had created opportunities for me to build something much larger and more meaningful than managing banking relationships for a single company. The foundation I had established using part of my legal settlement was now supporting dozens of women pursuing employment discrimination cases against major corporations. The foundation provided legal funding, expert testimony, and media support for cases that might otherwise be too expensive for individual plaintiffs to pursue effectively. Every few months, I received updates about Derek's imprisonment and the ongoing consequences he faced for his actions. His wife had successfully divorced him and retained most of their marital assets. His children had changed their surnames and refused contact with him. His former country club had expelled him and removed his name from their member directory. Derek Walsh had been erased from the business community he had tried to dominate through corruption. As I concluded my remarks at Titan Corp's shareholder meeting, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment of professional achievement and personal satisfaction. Derek Walsh had intended to destroy my career and eliminate my voice from corporate decision-making. Instead, his actions had launched me toward greater success, while creating lasting change that would protect countless other women from similar discrimination. The fight for justice had been difficult and expensive, but the outcomes exceeded every goal I had set when Amanda Richardson first encouraged me to pursue Derek's case aggressively. Justice had been served, systematic changes had been implemented, and my own life had been transformed in ways I never could have imagined when I was packing my belongings under security escort in Sterling's parking garage. Derek Walsh fired me believing that financial operations was redundant overhead. He discovered too late that some expertise cannot be replaced, some relationships cannot be rebuilt overnight, and some consequences cannot be avoided once they have been triggered. His $700 million mistake became my pathway to a career and life beyond anything I had thought possible. Looking forward, I knew there would always be more Derek Walshes in corporate America, executives who valued loyalty over competence, who eliminated expertise they didn't understand, and who used their power to discriminate against anyone who threatened their narrow worldview. But now there were also more women like me, armed with legal precedents, professional networks, and the knowledge that fighting back against corruption and discrimination was not only possible but necessary for creating lasting change. Have you ever witnessed discrimination or corruption in your workplace that you felt powerless to challenge? The Sterling case showed that individual courage, combined with strong legal advocacy and public attention, can create changes that protect entire generations of workers from similar treatment. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help other people discover it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about standing up for justice and accountability in corporate America. And please share this video with anyone who might benefit from knowing that fighting back against workplace discrimination is possible and worthwhile. Thank you for following my journey from terminated employee to advocate for corporate accountability. Remember that your expertise and integrity have value that cannot be eliminated by ignorant executives, and that standing up for what's right can create opportunities and outcomes beyond anything you might imagine possible. Sometimes the biggest professional disasters become the foundation for the most meaningful success stories.